that God works through broken earthen vessels. So she leans to me and says, you mentioned John Bunyan, 1972, not 1672. So she helps keep my feet on the ground and keep me properly perspective. Yeah. So Exodus chapter 3, we're going to continue here but not stay here the whole time. And again, we're building up towards the resurrection. I don't know, it seems like sort of an odd way to do that, but it fits in my head. So hopefully the pieces fall into place for you as well. Chapter 3, we'll read verses 1 through 9 this morning. Exodus 3:1. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. And when the Lord saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. So this is the overall thought, God's redemptive work in the spiritual life. And I hope you can just take some of these thoughts. And again, this morning, we're just going to look at a few things, not exhaustively. And I start Monday, and then I'm just like, there's no way I'm going to get through what So I'm just tapering it back. And I just want to give you bite-sized things to think on as we move forward and progress. Here's part of the reason why I look at Exodus as a great place to understand God's redemptive work. That to me is obvious. But the spiritual life, true spirituality, what it is. In chapter 20, we have the 10 Commandments. We all know, right? And so in chapter 20, we have the 10 Commandments given. And in verse 2, it says this in chapter 20, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Now it's so amazing because all the way from here on, it's like the Exodus is going to be something that's constantly looked back on. But God then says this, in verse 3 and 4, he says, You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and fourth generations to those who hate me. This introduces the 10 Commandments. We know the first part is our relationship to God, the second part our relationship to man. Here's the thing about spiritual life. It's the sort of exclamation point to all this. We should get what Moses is talking about when he is revealing what God is saying here. we should get what he's talking about, what true spiritual life is. But he comes down to verse 17, you shall not covet. It's like all of a sudden there's where we find what true spirituality is, where he moves to the inward. And he says, that's what it's all about. We should have seen that from the beginning all the way through the Ten Commandments. But the point of it is he gives this sort of exclamation point. You got to understand, when you look at these things, it's not just about this externalism or behaviorism. It's about inside. It's in your heart. It is that internal, right, reality of your life, the spiritual dimension of man. So that's what really is getting me thinking and going through Exodus and pondering these things in regards to God's redemptive work with the spiritual life, but that true spiritual life. What does it look like? And it really just starts with the heart. It starts with the inside and works its way outside. And over we see the nation of Israel, all the times they try to do it externally, right? And it just never works. It's just failure after failure after failure. That even the circumcision externally, they miss the point of the internal circumcision of the heart, right? So these are things that I'm wrestling with and walking through. But I take you back to Exodus 3, and we'll only look at the few verses here. There's so much to look at in this section of Moses' call, and I brought attention to it last time. We're going to come back and look at some things. So let me just start you off with this thought, okay? So we've probably heard this before. Maybe we even said this before. I like to think of God as, right? And then you fill in the blank. So I like to think God as that voice within me that speaks to me, you know? Or I like to think of God as a warm blanket on a cold winter's night, right? You know, he's comforting and he's, right? So I started thinking about this because you hear this, and what is it really saying? So I tell my kids, just think about what people say, right? The words, because they have meaning. And so often when we say things or think things and we don't stop and really ask, what are we saying when we say that, right? So this is what we're saying. This is a way of expressing a preferred way of looking at God. I like to think of God as, right? This is my preferred way of seeing God as, and then we fill in the blank of however we see God. But here's the problem is we become very subjective then. Well, I like to think of God like this, but then what happens is if we take this a little bit further, what happens is we start saying statements like that. I like to think of God as this. Well, then we start imposing upon him things that characterize him, that we think ought to characterize him, right? So now we're telling God who he is. You see what happens? And now we start down this trail of we start formulating a God in our own minds that we like, and we formulate this right? This object of worship, we say this is God. But the problem is then we start, some things we may think are true and reflect on God. Some things are not true. And so when we start thinking, well, I like to think of God as whatever, and then we go, well, God wouldn't do, you know, it's like God's this great grandfather in the sky. I was talking with the kids on Friday night, right? Great grandfather in the sky. Everything is good for me and he just wants to bless me. That's all he wants to do, right? So we think of God that way and then we go, well, God, there's no way he's going to do anything bad in my life. He's not going to bring trial. He's not going to bring hardship. There's going to be suffering. God wouldn't do that, right? Because we've already started down this pathway. I like to think of God as, well, then my God wouldn't do that, right? And then we start imposing upon him things that aren't really God. So just to say, start to think, right? It's okay to say I like to think of God as Scripture has revealed him to be, right? But that's usually not where we go with this. And sometimes the things that we think of God, when we look at the Bible, just go, man. So bringing in the doctrine of redemption and God's redemptive work, it's like we like the other part, the deliverance, but look what happened for the Passover. Right? There was judgment. We don't like to think that as a part of what God is doing, but it's a part of what God is doing. And part of our message to the world is judgment. There's going to be judgment. But what I see is theologians even nowadays are moving away from the thought of that, and even to the extent of, there isn't literally going to be a hell in the end, and actually everyone is going to be saved. So they all jumped in the boat with C.S. Lewis and they're universalists, right? But I don't see that in Scripture. You see what I'm saying? So this stuff just starts taking us down pathways we shouldn't be going. So here is the message, the title for this message. I give you it up front instead of at the hind end. And here it is. This is from Pharaoh, and he says, who is the Lord that I should obey him? Exodus 5:2. This message is about God. So we looked at Moses, and we looked at God and his working through him, and then this dead piece of wood. And I wasn't indicating that anyone here is a dead piece of wood, but just to let you know, be encouraged, right? For more than that, God still can work through us. But here it is. Who is the Lord that I should obey him? And it's intriguing to me because, as I started thinking 3:12, when God tells Moses and he appears to him and gives him his commission, he says, this is what you're going to do. He says in verse 12, chapter 3, certainly I will be with you, and this will be a sign to you that I sent you, that when you brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God of this mountain. You have two aspects here, but the statement, you shall worship God. Now, all the way through here, we're going to see that reference of worshiping God, worshiping God, worshiping God. And we looked at last time, the word for worship and to be a slave are the same words in Hebrew, avad. It's the same triliteral root. So what's awesome is this statement that he makes in 3:12 is this, Tavadun. This is to serve or to worship, and it is one of the most foremost words of worship in the Torah. It's like, so I'm sitting there thinking, if I want to understand what worship is, this is a good thing for me. Because the term here indicates keeping the commandments of God, serving Yahweh, being obedient to him. The sum total of the life of faith in the Old Testament is essentially that. So therefore, a true worshiper seeks to obey him. So then it goes beyond just singing, it goes to life, and it goes to all of life and everything that you do. It's walking in obedience to God. It is a life of active service. It reminds me of Romans 12:1, right? So Paul says, therefore, right? Therefore, brethren, I exhort you, I urge you, by the mercies of God, to present the body of you a sacrifice, living, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service of worship, latreon. And it's interesting because in Romans 12, he moves in to talk about all the dimensions of living out your life. And daily. It's not just about Sunday and that time that you sit to sing and listen to the Word of God. It's like everything that you do, even how you deal with the government is an act of worship to God. It's like totally transforming, right? When Paul comes in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 3, and he looks at his life, and he talks about the fact that he is so grateful. And he says, I cherish his gratitude towards God. And he says, whom I serve. Same word there, but the verb form. Who I worship with my life, from my forefathers in a pure conscience. In other words, Paul looked at his whole life, and in 2 Timothy, he knows he's going to die. This is the end of it. And he looks at his life, and he sees it as this grand act of worship to God. So this is awesome because he says, you're going to come and you're going to worship me. And then he brings him the mountain. What does he give him? He gives him the 10 Commandments. Right? So then we understand God's redemptive work. We understand spiritual life. We understand we're talking about life is worship. Everything in life is worship. And especially obedience. Changes how we see then everything, right, that we do in life. Even the seemingly mundane things. And it makes me think too then, because you look at this act of obedience, but you also realize there are things that we're supposed to do that we don't do. Like, we think about when we look at the holiness of God, we talk about sins of commission, like I lie, I cheat, I steal. These are acts that we do. But you realize that there's also sins of omission, things that we fail to do, we're supposed to do. Like be gracious and kind and loving. And we hold those things back, that's sin. So all of this just sort of sets the base for what is to come. They're going to bring them out to me and they're going to worship. But it's a life of service and obedience. And a title for anyone in the Old Testament of great honor, highest honor, was to be called a servant of Yahweh. So they went from slavery to slavery, right? But the good kind of slavery. Because we're serving God. We're bringing Him glory. So elements of Exodus, three things. The key word, deliverance. The meaning of Exodus, the Greek word is exit or departure. And then the geography, Egypt, wilderness, and then Mount Sinai. And they park it there until Numbers. And they got to park it there because they got to get some things straightened out. They're a mess. So the first two chapters, just do this for you. The first two chapters, two themes emerge. First, the plight. And I say the preparation of the children of Israel. God, when He made the covenant with Abraham, He told them this was going to happen. Your descendants are going to be in slavery for 400 30 years, right? And then all of a sudden, at the end of all of that, God's going to come, He's going to deliver them. All of that is preparation. Even the suffering was all about God's preparation for the deliverance, for the spiritualness. Then comes in chapter 2, the privilege, the plight, and the preparation of the deliverer. Chapter 2, Moses prepared him. So, we talked about Moses. Can I just encourage you again? There's just no one seemingly too small, no place too insignificant for God to use. And sometimes we look at Moses and go, well, I know he had those objections, but still, it was Moses. Look what he did, right? We think, well, I can't be like that, okay? So, 2 examples, church history. I love church history. 2 examples. Spurgeon and John Owen. And anyone who knows anything about church history should know these 2, right? Charles Spurgeon, John Owen. Okay? The reason why I pick these 2 individuals, several reasons. First is that these 2, the amount of things that they had written in their lifetime for the Christian faith is astounding. So John Owen, he heard someone talking about the doctrine of perseverance in the saints and they were wrong. So he responds by writing an over 600-page document on the doctrine of the perseverance of the saints. This was the kind of stuff that these guys did. They wrote all kinds, and the things that they were involved in was just amazing. Okay? So they just touched so many lives for the sake of God's work. Here's what's amazing about these 2 men, because you say, well, I'm not going to be either one of those. I don't write anything. And see, here's the thing that's so awesome about these 2 men, okay? Is that with all of that, they both had the similar beginning. So Spurgeon, when he was 16, was heading off to a well-known chapel for worship. And there was a snowstorm. It was so bad that he was diverted. He went off to a little Methodist chapel nearby. And there, the pastor wasn't there, and there was just a layman from the body who was speaking that day. Isaiah 45:22. Turn to me and be saved, all the ends of the earth. For I am God, and there is no other. Now, as Spurgeon tells it, this guy said this over and over and over again. He called him stupid. He said this man was so stupid because he couldn't say anything else other than just keep saying the same passage over and over and over again. You know what happened to Spurgeon? He was saved as a result of that. John Owen. So he was to go with his cousin to hear a well-known preacher during the times of Puritans and so on. So they're heading off. They get there. Well, the speaker didn't show up. So his cousin says to him, well, let's go down the road to this other chapel. I know the minister, let's go hear him preach. And he said, let's just stay here. So someone out of the body came up and spoke. And the same thing happened to John Owen. Now here's what's amazing. We all know who Spurgeon and John Owen are and all the things that they did. But there is not one record in history as to the names of those individuals who preached those messages that awakened them to spiritual life. But they were necessary. They were necessary. So just say, no one may not know your name, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. God does. God does. So all this is preparation, right? So here's Exodus. This is the 2-part outline for the book. The redemption of Israel from Egypt, chapters 1 through 18. The revelation to Israel at Sinai, chapters 19 through 40. The first part, the Lord's acquisition of the seed of Abraham, and then the Lord's covenant with the nation of Israel. I bring you here because we walked through this and we looked at the oppression of Israel in the first few sections. We saw the reality of what was going on. The midwives are brought before Pharaoh and he says, look, when they have boy children, I want you to get rid of them. The girls, they can live. They didn't obey. They feared God more. Then comes the deliverer of Israel in chapter 2, verse 1 through 4:31. And it's interesting because as we look at this, I love this because not only do we see the things that Moses did, the amazing things, we also see his weaknesses and failures. And I love that. We read these missionary stories and oftentimes you hear about all these things that they do, but you don't hear about the tough stuff, right? So I picked up this book by Adoniram Judson. It was about his life and that. And whoever authored it was awesome because they didn't leave the bad stuff out. All the other stuff that he wrestled with, the weaknesses, the trials and suffering, all that stuff was in it. Because sometimes we read the missionary stories and we just think, man, I can't be like, it's like these superheroes, right? These amazing people, and they do all these great things. And just realize they're just people, right? Broken sinners after the fall, just like we are. But God's going to prepare Moses. So the first part of this preparation comes in Egypt in chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. This is where he learned the skills of the educated man. He learned to read and write. And Stephen says he was powerful in word. In other words, he is going to write the word of God, communicate it. He was powerful in word. So it's interesting because there was this men's thing. We got together. And there was a leader in the church down south. And he was a part of this. And he is involved in the realm of science. So he was talking about the fact that with Moses, as he records Genesis, right? He wrote what he did in Genesis. It was a 6-day creation, but that isn't really what happened. We know better because science tells us differently, right? And so he was going on to say the reason why, because someone challenged him, the reason why that God had Moses write that was because we wouldn't understand the truth of how things really came into existence. So he had him write it that way, and then later we come to understand the truth through science. Like somehow Moses is a bumpkin, we're all bumpkins, and then we get... But listen, this is not the testimony of Scripture about Moses. This was a man who was mighty in word. He well understood what God was telling him to write down about how things started, right? Literal 6-day creation. So this was a part of his development. But it's interesting because during this time then, this has become a big decision in his life. He's going to have to choose, and it has to do with identification. Do I stay in the royal palace, or do I identify myself with my people? And you can read Hebrews 11, 24 through 26. There's a testimony he's given as to what was going on in his heart. He, by faith, is going to turn away from the riches and the palace and all the opportunities it had. He's going to join himself to his people. But the enthusiasm just carried him away. He ended up killing an Egyptian, and then he has to take off and flee. So this brought about the misunderstanding of the people, brought about anger from Pharaoh, and then no doubt brought about disappointment and frustration from Moses, so he's going to go off to Midian. And this can be a second part of God's preparations. He's going to head to Midian, he's going to find himself a wife. It's a good way to start for ministry. Get yourself a wife, tend some sheep for a while. 40 years he's in preparation, right? 40 years. God's going to get him ready. Here he's going to learn the ways of spiritual and intellectual maturity. And all this time he's going to learn how to shepherd sheep. And what he's going to find out is sheep are stubborn, but people are even more stubborn. It's going to take humility. And Scripture tells us he was the most humble man. This is where it was refined. That took patience, and he was pushed to the brink, right? He went over the edge. There was a point where he just said, God, take me now. Take me now. I can't handle these people. Just take me now. Or like Joshua comes and says, hey, there's men who are prophesying and saying these things in the village, in the camp, and we got to do something about it. Moses goes, man, I wish everyone was gifted by the Spirit and could do this, man. Are you kidding me? Just let them be. Let them be. But he was going to be pushed. And the other thing that he had to develop was sensitive, watchful care. To watch over the sheep, to care for them, to watch for predators and those that were going to destroy them and afflict them. All of this was necessary. All of this was a part of preparation, becomes the mission. Now this is important because we saw that as the narrative moves, finally it slows down right here into the conversation between Moses and God. And this is at the center of his ministry. It is about God. So we're going to end with these thoughts. And I'm just going to plant these seeds in your head. And we can't even get into everything. I mean, I wanted to get into I am. In verse 4, I am. Seriously, I mean, infinite spirit. I could spend hours just talking about God, infinite spirit. Can't even get into that. But here's what's cool. So here, God is going to reveal himself to Moses. There's going to be a communication. And I think sometimes we read these things, we don't stop and think about what's happening here. Right? So notice with me in verses 2 through 4. So the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of this bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet it was not consumed. So Moses, he turns aside to see what's going on here, why the bush is not burned up. And then all of a sudden the Lord sees do this, and then God called to him. God spoke to him. Sometimes we read these things, we don't stop and think, well, what is that saying? What are the implications of that? Like I do that with the kids, and Friday we were talking about the statement, I am. Well, what does that mean? I am. God doesn't say I'm becoming, he just says I am. Well, what does that say, right? I mean, there's so much there, but we don't stop to unpack this. In other words, God spoke to Moses. Moses heard a voice clearly, and he responded to it, verse 4. He's having a conversation with God. What does that tell us? That we have a personal God. A personal being who communicates in ways that we understand. So here he comes to Moses in a burning bush. He meets him where he is. So Moses has been in this wilderness for 40 years. He knows the terrain, right? He knows the area. He's been there. God meets him in a burning bush. He meets him right where he is. Well, what about Joshua? How did he appear to Joshua? As a soldier, right? Because this is all that Joshua knows. He's a warrior. He's a fighter. He's going to go off and fight battle. So God appears to him as the commander-in-chief. He meets Joshua where he is. But just think about the implications of that. Because we're going to be told something about God. God is transcendent here. He's going to tell us that. But at the same time, He is eminent. He is personal. He knows you. He calls you by name. He cares about you. And He calls you in such a unique, personal way. He speaks to us so that we would understand. It's amazing because then you realize that God who created us to be able to understand the communication He gives. He gave us all the things necessary spiritually to have this relationship with God, have this communion and this communication with God. So when you walk through this section, just tell you, we can't even unpack everything, but this revelation here from God, it's so amazing. And the theology that is here is so important for everything that's going to happen in the rest of the letter. It sets the stage for everything to follow. But we have to remember, this is self-revelation. In other words, Moses didn't go by this by trial and error. Like I've searched these things, I've done it, and all of a sudden I come to this theological truth. No, God is the one who revealed this. Moses didn't discover it. Which tells us that if we're going to know anything about God, God has to tell us. Theology is only possible if God gives revelation. Well, it tells me that when I come to this book, that's His revelation, His self-revelation to us. It's such a gift, isn't it? It's such a gift. That when I open it, God speaks. Does He not? God speaks. God reveals. God tells us about who He is and how we should think of Him and how we should worship Him. What our life looks like walking with Him. Leviticus, that's what it's all about. How do you approach me and how do you walk in light of a relationship with me? But here's the thing. How dusty do our Bibles get sitting on the shelf? Right? God has spoken. Don't we want to hear Him? So we realize that when we're talking about revelation from God, it's not passive. He's not becoming manifest. He's making Himself known. The God who is infinite and transcendent, He is incomprehensible. He has made Himself knowable. I can know God, but not completely and fully, but I can know Him. So we have here this supernatural act, this supernatural communication from God. It's personal. He's omniscient. He's omnipotent. He's the living God. This is the God that we serve. This is the God of redemption. This is the God of our life. The other thing about this passage is it reveals that God's self-communication from the burning bush. Now, this is interesting because notice verse 2. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in the blazing fire from the midst of the bush. We say, okay, well, it's an angel, right? It's an angel. But, let's move on. Verse 4. Then when the Lord saw that he had turned aside, God called to him from where? From the midst of the bush and said. So who's the angel of the Lord? It's God Himself. And I believe that this is the second person of the Trinity, God the Son, the pre-incarnate. That here He is speaking to Moses through this bush. And He's going to meet him where he is. Now, it's interesting because I was reading, There's all kinds of explanations about this burning bush. You got all these authors writing, and these are just great godly men, right? So they're describing the bush, and one's like, oh, this is like, well, there's a certain kind of bush that's in that part of the wilderness, and it has these oils and these little buds, and when they burst, it's like they get these little sparks. And then some say, well, because the electricity from God's presence being there, that these little buds, and they sparked it like little flashes of flame, whatever like that, and then they go out. So you get all these physical explanations about what happened. Let me just tell you, this is simply clear what it says. Moses saw a bush, it was on fire, and it wasn't consumed. That's it. That's it. So when it says that the sun stood still for Joshua, what do you think happened? Sun stood still. That's all I got to say. Which means that we have a God who intervenes into history. So we believe in a world that says that this world is governed by an ironclad set of rules. It's governed by these things. And if there is a God, He can't intervene. That's not possible. Essentially, that even the deists believe that they say, well, God created everything, set everything in motion, and then he sort of handcuffed Himself so that He can't operate in His world because He created these natural forces that operate and control and guide everything. That's not true. We see that with all of that, God intervenes into this world. He is a God who is immanent. He is a God who works in time and space and history. He is working in our lives as well in the same way. I may not see a burning bush, but my God is active in my life all the time. All the time. His hand is in it. So when Moses saw this was unusual, this was supernatural, this was clearly communication from God, and Moses understood this. Verse 3, Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight. I've never seen anything like this before. The bush is on fire, but it's not being consumed. The next thing, and this is the last thing I want to look at, God's self-communication of holiness. Can't even unpack everything, but just talk about the question that Pharaoh asked. Who is this God that I should obey Him? To me, this is so important. I find intriguing that this is revealed before we even get to the great declaration, I am. God is going to reveal something about His nature here, and it is His holiness. And in chapter 3, verse 5, it says this, and God said, do not approach any closer. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. So here's the thing. God is immanent. He came in. He entered into human history. He met Moses where he was at, right? In a bush, out in the wilderness where he tends sheep. But here's the thing. He says, back off. God meets us where we are, but understand this. He still maintains His awe and reverence and holiness. Sometimes we do that when we talk about the life of Jesus Christ and His relationship to sinners. To be careful, because He was perfect. He was sinless. He was holy. Holy. See, again, we get that thought, right? I like to think of God as. We like to think of God as being holy. So the holiness of God, several things are involved. Only look at two of them here. Holiness involves separation. Notice verse 5. Do not approach any closer. Not only that, but he was to take a stance of reverence. We talk about the holiness of God. There is a separation from, there's a relational quality to it. And this is important because it affects how we then live our life. Because the next thing is the holiness of God and fear. Do we fear God? But sometimes we take that away and we say, well, fear hasn't anything to do with the New Testament. Well, what does Paul say in Ephesians 5? Submitting to one another in what? In the fear of Christ. It's a New Testament thing, brothers and sisters. And it isn't be left at Mount Sinai. Romans 1, as Paul builds the case against humanity and their sinfulness, chapter 3, as he gets to the long list of all of these things, they never do this, never do this. He gets down there, he says, do not fear God. That's the whole thing. I mean, everything about it. The reason why they do everything that they do, sinful humanity, is they don't fear God. So holiness involves separation. We go to chapter 19. Notice it because this carries on for the nation as well. Chapter 19, verses 10 and following. Then the Lord also said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and then let them wash your garments. Verse 11 of chapter 19 of Exodus, and let them be ready for the third day. For on the third day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. You shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, beware that you do not go up to the mountain or touch the border of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Verse 13, no hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot through, whether beast or man, he shall not live. Separation. This is at the heart of the term for holiness, kadosh. Greek word hagiadzo, it is to set apart, to separate. That's a crucial element to understanding God's holiness, separation. He's separated from all of us, His creatures. He's separated from sin and evil. So go through the tabernacle, right? I'm just going to walk through this, but through the tabernacle, in our mind's eye, we can see both parts of the tabernacle. You had places that were dedicated to be set apart, right, from evil and sin of the world. You had the holy place. It was dedicated to God's service. Then you go even further in and you have the Holy of Holies. And then you had that veil, right, that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. Exodus chapter 26, verse 33. And in that place, the Holy of Holies, is where the Ark of the Covenant was going to be kept. That was the place, the residence of God, when He would come in His Shekinah glory. Separation. The great thing about Christ on the cross, the veil was what? It was torn in two. Holiness. The holiness of God. It involves separation. Separation. Notice the Sabbath, Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. The Lord blessed the Sabbath day and He did what? He made it holy. This is PL form in Hebrew, kadash, means to make it holy, to make it hallowed. He hallowed that day and made it holy. The tabernacle, the altar, Aaron and his sons, they were all, Exodus 29:44, they were all made holy. This starts the process. This revelation that God gives to Moses in the burning bush about this, that He is holy, and therefore there needs to be separation, there needs to be consecration, there needs to be a setting apart, and ultimately then as the people, they're going to be brought out of Egypt, and the two-parter here in 3:12, they're going to be brought out of Egypt, this great deliverance, this redemption, and then they're going to come to God and serve Him on the mountain. They're going to be separated from and unto God. This pictures what happens to us in the work of redemption. Right? God called His people out of Egypt. He brought them to Himself and He commanded them to obey His voice. And He said, you shall be to me a kingdom, a priest, and a holy nation. Same is true for us as the church, is it not? But see, understanding the question, who is this God that I should obey Him? This is where we start. Who is this God? He's holy. How do I obey Him? I walk in holiness. Two parts in separation from sin and reflected in Egypt. Read Leviticus 18, 3-5, right? God talks about you're not going to do the sins of the land from which you're coming from, and you're going to fulfill the sins of the land you're entering into, and then the devotion to God, serving Him and obeying His statutes. That is what makes a holy nation. And that is what makes us a holy nation. Then holiness and fear. Notice with me verse 6, we end with this. He said also, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham. Notice He says father, singular, not plural, not fathers, but father. Contemplate that. The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Fear. Fear. Proverbs chapter 1 verse 7, the motto of the book. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Right? So we soften this. We soften this so often. Read Exodus chapter 20. When God comes on Mount Sinai and the fear that shook the people because the mountain shook and the smoke and the fire and the consumingness of what was there, and they were afraid. And Moses tells them that, don't be terrified, but what you do is this fear is to keep you from doing what? Is to keep you from sinning. Part of our problem as believers is we do not understand the God that we worship, that He's a holy God. There has to be separation. There has to be fear. And it wasn't removed with Jesus Christ. This starts the process of understanding who is this God? Who is this God and how should we obey Him? This just opens the door. We'll come back and we'll look some more at the revelation that God gives to Moses. But prayerfully, I pray that we reflect on this because we're looking at, as we come towards the resurrection, we're looking at the redemptive work of God. Who is it that is doing this? What has He done in our lives? 1 Corinthians, you stand in the state of being sanctified in Christ Jesus. You are a called out community. Chapter 5, then why are you allowing sin to be in the body? Remove this yeast from you, right? Why is there immorality? Why is there all of these things? And partly it is because we're not asking the question that Pharaoh asked and listening to the answer that God gives. I am a holy God. There needs to be separation and there needs to be fear. Dad, would you close in order of prayer, please?